A very warm welcome to you, Vish. We are thrilled to have you here with us tonight. Handing the session over to you.
Thank you so much, Shema. I really appreciate the warm welcome and the introduction. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen here. Okay, great. And just to confirm, you can see my screen and hear me?
Yes, both.
Okay, wonderful. Well, good evening, everyone. As Shema mentioned, my name is Vish. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you all. Thank you so much to the Institute of Product Leadership for having me and Shema for organizing this. So I'm excited to speak to you all about product teams are learning communities. And this is sort of a topic that I've been passionate about for a while because I think as I've sort of observed successful product teams and successful products over time, the pattern that I've observed is that teams and individuals that are great at learning and turning that knowledge into action is perhaps the most important trait that leads to success. So looking forward to diving in with you all. I'm super excited that there's such a huge prize at stake. So I'm excited to hear all of your questions as well. So in terms of how I'll run this, I'll just start with a quick introduction on my part, tell you a little bit about my career journey into product management, and then I'll go into sort of a few different aspects of what I think sort of learning breaks down to from a product perspective, specifically market research, customer research, and then product analytics. And then we'll leave about 5 to 10 minutes for questions at the end. And please do sort of put in your questions into the chat feature or in the Q&A feature in Zoom, as well as in LinkedIn. And we'll make sure we sort of select the top questions and answer them at the end. All right, so let's get going. You already heard sort of my background when Shema gave the introduction, but maybe I can tell you a little bit about my path that isn't so much on the slide. Today I'm a lead product manager at Evidation Health, and I think as maybe you've heard, there's a lot of different meandering paths into product management. And mine started in sort of business and consulting. So I did my undergrad in business administration, and I started off my career in sort of general, strategy consulting, as perhaps many people coming from business schools that have no idea what they actually want to do end up doing. And I sort of discovered my passion for building through consulting. And for me, that was the path, but there's plenty of other paths that people take, either through engineering, software development, design, et cetera, et cetera. For me, it was working with large corporations, large clients in a bunch of different industries, including oil and gas, high tech, healthcare, and ultimately realizing that while I was helping sort of senior executives tackle questions that were strategically important to them. So one example could be, I have a set of products currently in the US, and I want to expand to another country. Which country should I expand to? All the way to, I have a large distributed workforce, and what is the sort of resource plan that we can put in place to work more efficiently? And what I started to gravitate towards is whenever I was working on something that was specific to a product, to designing, developing, and launching a new product solving the needs of an end user, that's when I was most excited. And, I sort of, after having that insight about, personally what motivated me, lo and behold, there was an entire career track, dedicated specifically to that. So sort of fell into product management. And had my first product management gig at Boston Consulting Group in their digital ventures division. So you can think of that as a startup studio where we were hired to come up with what is an MVP of a product, and then building and launching that, including all of the sort of the scaffolding around it, right? So like building and launching the startup. And so the rest is history. Launched several products and companies there, and I'm now delighted to be at Evidation Health, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. So that's me. Let's keep going here. So I work at Evidation Health, and just sort of a quick summary. I'll be giving several examples from my experience here throughout this talk, so it might help to have a little bit of context. So we are a platform with sort of a consumer product and then an enterprise product. On the consumer side, we have a little over 4 million members, and essentially our members get points and other rewards for taking health actions. So some of those health actions could be simply logging steps. So the more steps that you take as tracked by your Apple Watch or Fitbit, et cetera, the more points you get. So we've tracked over 1 trillion steps since we've launched. But also you can fill out surveys and take other health actions and enroll in research. And we've had over 1 million participants in health-related research. Which gets me to the enterprise side. So we work with many large companies in the healthcare space, including large pharma companies and sometimes nonprofits and government agencies in order to conduct research and to run health programs. All of this is based on a foundation of user privacy and control over permissioned health data. So of course we collect quite a bit of data in the context of these studies and health programs, but we're always super careful about being upfront to the user about what data we're collecting and for what use, and to explicitly ask for permission for any future use. And a little bit of context, the company was founded in 2012, raised about 250 million in venture capital. And we actually just raised a recent round, 150 million in our Series E, in order to fund expansion from what has been, sort of historically the focus around studies, moving into virtual health programs. So our portfolio of virtual health programs, that's the aspect of the product that I lead. So many, the examples that you'll hear will be specific to what is the MVP? How do we learn as quickly as possible? Because running virtual health programs is in many ways a brand new space for us. So it is critically important to learn as quickly as possible, hence the topic of this talk. So let's dive in. In its simplest form, what does a product manager do? It's to decide what to build next, right? You will always have a resource constrained environment. You'll always have fewer developers and fewer designers than you would like. And you'll always have more ideas of what to build. And you'll always have a sort of a bigger ambition than what is possible to build. So all of that put together, constrained resources, big ambitions, all of that has to be distilled down into, okay, so what should we build next so that we can sort of move the needle on our objectives and both in terms of user engagement or business impact, et cetera, but also long-term, right? How do we deliver on a longer-term roadmap and deliver on the product vision and company vision? So in many ways, for me, this boils down to the question of, okay, so we neither really know what the problem is, right? So we'll be getting into sort of market and customer research in a moment here, but we also sort of by definition don't know what the solution is, right? So we're sort of operating in an environment where we have so many unknowns, both on what we're solving for and how to solve for it. And, because a product manager is a steward of the product, you will also be getting a lot of questions from all of your stakeholders and, probably personally have a lot of questions. And just some examples here on this slide, we want to expand to a new market and need to know what's different there. What about the product needs to change to expand to this new market? We have a new idea and I want to see if there's demand for it. Ideally before I commit a bunch of resources and build the thing and only then find out that there isn't demand. I want continuous insight into how my product is doing out in the wild and whether my customers' needs are changing. I'd like to get ahead of that. And, there's a lot of competition. We want to stay relevant. And these for me are all questions that a PM will be asked and a PM needs to have appropriate answers to. So before I get to, what are the 3 different types of learning that I want to talk through, I think I'll once again like to reinforce that what I've seen is that the best PMs are excellent at prioritizing learning, right? They're excellent at figuring out, okay, that is an unknown, that is an assumption, that is a risk to ultimately what value I want to deliver and what I want my product to deliver. And that's where I'm going to prioritize what to learn first. And I'd say that this is as much a question about PMs themselves learning as it is about creating a culture and creating the infrastructure and putting in place the resourcing and hiring the right people for the product team to have a culture of learning. So this really gets back to, the title of the talk, right? Product teams are learning communities. Really what we're talking about here is both the PM and all of the other functions that are involved in the product, whether that is product operations, product design, of course, engineering and software development, and even data science, data analysis. All of these sort of functions and stakeholders come together in order to create this learning engine. All right. So as I mentioned, 3 topics we'll talk about today. The first is market research. So one sort of general bucket of questions, bucket of learning is market research. And you can define that as market and competitive dynamics, right? So what is the overall context in which I'm operating? And this could involve a lot of different factors, which we'll get into. Bucket number 2 then is customer research. So this is now zooming in into who is your customer, what do they want and need? So what is a specific unmet need or the pain point that we can address as a product? So that's customer research. And then finally, product analytics. The question here is, okay, we understand the market, we understand the customer, but now what are customers actually doing in our product? So this is very powerful because it's more quantitative. It's also, it's actual behavior. It's not sort of self-reported behavior. And I think one of the most important skill sets within overall this bucket of learning. And slightly different skill set as well, because it moves from more qualitative to quantitative research. So looking forward to getting into that. So let's go ahead and start with market research. So my section here on market research is going to be a little bit shorter because I think that in general, it's a very broad topic, but also one that is sort of table stakes. You need an understanding of your industry, you need an understanding of the competitive landscape, and then you have to quickly move, especially sort of the product, the product leader, the product manager's mindset is how do I move quickly into building something and testing it with my customers versus just sort of stewing in research. But still very important. So just a couple slides on this. I have a few examples here of the types of topics that you would care about from a market research perspective. Generally speaking, branding, positioning, I actually like to start here because the way your competition talks about themselves tells you a lot about their strategy. I think it is incredibly underrated how important it is to just go to a company's website and scan, what is their tagline? What is a value proposition that they've identified that they think resonates most with their customers? Of course, what is their product portfolio? And then sort of classic, who is their team? And stalk them on LinkedIn and figure out sort of what backgrounds they have. So, starting once again with branding and positioning, you really want to know who is the target audience in any given industry. What slogans and marketing messages are being used, and what sort of brand values are expressed through all of that. In my case, where we are starting to build new health programs, it's an incredibly crowded and fragmented space. And in some ways, there's also just an incredible gap. It's very difficult to launch programs to help patients manage, any number of chronic conditions like diabetes or heart failure. And there are so many different approaches to reach the end user, right? Whether that's through like a provider system, like a hospital system, or whether that's through health insurance or through a pharma company. Especially in the US, the healthcare industry is so large, but also so fragmented that it's actually pretty remarkable to see all the different approaches that a different company can take and who they sell to and who is their end user. So branding and position becomes a very important exercise there to really start to sort of segment out what are the different types of companies that we're competing with. Next is product and service. I purposefully sort of put this in the middle because most product managers would go to this first, and I'd recommend not necessarily skipping to it. Because before you care about what specific features are currently available in any given competitor's product, you really care first about what is the value proposition, what is the unmet need that this product solves for, and then you sort of draw the through line to, okay, so these are the features they've built, and you can now sort of look ahead. Here are the features that they're likely building. Where are they going? right? You don't want to be stuck in a place where you're trying to achieve feature parity with where your competitors are today, because by the time you build it, they'll be where they're already going, and you're behind right when you launch. So, but of course, very important to do product teardowns, right? Install every app of your competitors and poke around and figure out what features are built, what integrations are in place, what sort of customer support is in place, and what is the sort of design language, what is the UI and UX. If it's a physical product, order it. Yeah, what is the end-to-end experience of e-commerce through delivery through returns. And then finally, business model. This will vary quite a bit based on what industry you're in and precisely what your business model is. Business models in the healthcare space are very complex because often the payer is different from the user. So really understanding who pays and what are they paying for, and how do you price effectively against that. And especially when it comes to business models and pricing, a lot of this is dictated by expectations. So what is the going rate for what is a market rate for a certain service? And really understand, and have a clear answer for if the market rate for X service, in our case, it might be to run a study, is X amount, then why should we be less and why should we be more? And having a clear answer for that. Ideally, it's more, right? And you're sort of offering some sort of premium service that's differentiated against competitors. But early on, when you're an MVP and you've just launched, you probably can't make that claim. So how do you appropriately peg against the market and say, this is what our product does, and this is why our pricing is what it is. So just some examples of the types of topics that one would care about in terms of market research. So just to kind of wrap up the section a little bit, as you might imagine, there are several advantages to starting with this sort of research, for starting with this sort of learning. And it's really centered around understanding the context, right? Having credibility, understanding the broader market, including competitors and other stakeholders, which once again is especially relevant in healthcare because you have so many stakeholders involved in care delivery. But it's also about reducing risk, right? Don't make the mistakes that others have already made. And it's really just about having that sort of 360-degree vision of the broader context within which you're building your product. But it's also really important, I think, to understand the limitations of market research. Every good PM I've ever worked with has this sort of burning desire to move quickly past market research, move quickly past reports, and into, so what is our hypothesis for what we're going to build, and then test and learn in market. So oftentimes a PM might feel a little frustrated that it might be a little too high level and not necessarily actionable, and might not be suited for specific product decisions. And of course, because this can be very subjective, and a lot of people are just sort of looking at their LinkedIn feed and seeing headlines that are coming up and just sort of sending articles and email and Slack, there can be a lot of confirmation bias. If someone already has, one of your maybe executive leaders already have, an assumption that a particular company is your key competitor, all you're going to get is headlines about that one company, which will end up sort of will end up confirming a bias that someone already has. So very important to try and sort of offset those things. But overall, I just like to emphasize that it is very important to have this context, to not skip it entirely, to understand the market, understand your competitors, and work off of that foundation. So, where and how do you conduct market research? So this is just some examples of sources that I've used in the past. There are plenty of companies that publish and write, pretty extensive research reports in almost any industry and any sort of vertical that you can imagine. Gartner, IBISWorld, there are tons of others out there. They can be very expensive. So, be thoughtful about whether that makes sense for your particular context. But of course, you can always just go to LinkedIn, go to Wikipedia, go anywhere where there's sort of free information available. But, that's sort of buyer beware, right? Make sure you filter for what content is actually accurate and relevant. So that's kind of more, how do you find effective research that's already been conducted and consume that? I've gotten a lot of value from expert interviews. So there are a couple expert interview networks like GLG and Alpha Sites. There are lots more out there. And essentially what you can do, this is still pretty pricey, but can be very helpful because you'll come with a specific set of questions and you can essentially talk to seasoned experts in almost any topic. You can, I can say, I want to talk to a physician. I want to talk to a physician that has a lot of experience in managing chronic conditions in rural America. And I want to talk to 5 of them. And GLG and Alpha Sites or other expert interview networks would be able to go out and recruit those people. And I could, talk to those physicians and ask them questions about what solutions do you use today? And, how much do you pay for those solutions? That sort of thing. But more on customer research in just a minute here. But finally, market research by definition is everywhere, right? So go to Reddit, find the community of people that are passionate about this topic, and figure out what companies they're talking about, and what market trends they're talking about. Listen to podcasts, and then it's so underrated. But go to your own internal stakeholders and teams that are plugged into the outside world, right? That as a part of their day jobs aren't confined to the 4 walls of your company. So your sales team, set up a one-on-one with your head of business development, or with any of the sales team that are focused on the particular area that you're building your product, and just have a conversation. Figure out who are we losing to? What are the competing products? What are customers saying on what their needs are? And just have that constant flow of communication, including, with other functions that have interfaces with the outside world, like customer support. Great. So we're going to pause here with our first poll question. So I've gone through a few different examples of what market research looks like in the context of product management. So Shama, please launch that poll. There we go. And I'm curious what you all think about where the responsibility for market research lies. The reality is this ends up often being pretty sort of dispersed through various functions. And I'm just sort of curious, in your experience, which functions are primarily responsible for this? Okay, pretty even split so far. One more vote for product. No one. Yeah, depending on your size, depending on the size of your organization, often this might intentionally be no one explicitly tagged to market research, which is sort of part of the founder's responsibility or just sort of everyone's responsibility. But very interesting to see. I think we have closed the poll perfect. So, half of everyone said that product management is responsible for market research. And then we have sort of one vote each for strategy and operations, sales and commercial, and no one. And this is actually very interesting to see because I think over time, more and more of this sort of market sensing and just general sort of context, understanding competitors and understanding the market has started to sort of more become a part of the product management skill set and product management function. Traditionally, that would have been part of like a strategy or a market intelligence type function. And I think slowly that's starting to get closer to the product function, which I think is a great thing. It probably means that PMs are even more stretched than they were before, and that's probably not amazing. But in terms of how this knowledge gets used, I think it makes a lot of sense because ultimately it should be used to inform how do we build a better product and how do we compete better and how do we better understand our end user. And having that sort of nexus of understanding the market closer to the nexus of decision making, I think is overall overall the right answer. Okay, great. All right, we can keep going here. So second bucket then, customer research. So if market research is about market and competitive dynamics, customer research is zooming way in and getting into the head of our customers. So what do they want and what do they need? And even before that, who are they, right? How do we define our target segment? How do we define our target persona? Excuse me. So I think that Dilbert has a comic that's sort of relevant to anything related to product management and is sort of cathartic sometimes just to like scroll through and just feel so heard. I'll give you a moment to read through this. I think this comic is brilliant and hilarious, but also just all too true. So often we think that customer research is just going around and asking our colleagues, or worse yet, that we already have a clear idea of our customer because we might be so experienced, we've been doing product management for decades, or we've been in health tech for decades, and I don't need to talk to customers, I already know them. And this happens so often that, you know, PMs, product teams, executives, that we tend to be a little arrogant, that we can make decisions on behalf of our customers, and that we are a good proxy for them. And I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that that is just simply not true, no matter how much experience you have. I think it's just human nature for us to sort of confuse ourselves with our customers, and to sort of overestimate our ability to do so. And I think, you know, in particular in healthcare, so, you know, again, currently building a health program in chronic disease management. And I think the challenges that someone faces when they're juggling multiple health conditions and a job and a family is easy to talk about in the abstract, but very difficult to understand in terms of the lived experience and the specific unmet needs and what is actually realistic about what, you know, level of engagement you can expect or what specific features are valuable within the product. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this section is how do you take all of those unknowns about the customer and about the product that you could build and build a muscle to engage directly with potential customers to test those assumptions. So broadly speaking, I think about customer research as you're validating your assumptions, right? You could go out and just have conversations with all of your customers, but that may not end up being fruitful because, you know, by definition, a conversation could go in any number of directions. But you really want to learn, you want to prioritize your learning for what is most important to prioritize what to build. And for me, that falls into two buckets. The first is the problem statement. So do I have a clear understanding of the unmet need, of the customer pain point? So, you know, start by writing down, what are my assumptions on the problem statements? So you can see here an example from Uber, right? So I need to find a way to find a cab when I need one, and it's very difficult to hail one, and many taxis only accept cash, right? So this is an articulation of my assumption around the problem statement. But equally important is my solution hypotheses. So what do I believe will change about customer behavior if I change a condition, right? So if I build an app allowing, you know, users to book rides and making it simple to pay, then riders will use our app. So really sort of listing out what are your problem statements, what are your hypotheses, and then targeting your customer research to validate those. And once again, validation is not about having a meeting with your team and asking them, does this make sense? Validating this is getting out of the building. For now, we're all sort of trapped at home. So finding the equivalent of getting out of the building, doing it virtually. And there are lots of great ways to do that. So let's get through you know, a few examples here of the types of strategies that you could use. So in general, meet your customers where they are, right? So, you know, in the pre-COVID world and the post-COVID world, this could mean literally going, I've done this. I've gone to a train station and just stood there with a clipboard and asked people if they have time to talk. and just ask them a few questions, on a given topic. And then I gave them a $25 Starbucks gift card, right? Go out into the world and talk to your customers. Get out of the four walls of your building. And this matters on, very much on the context, right? So there are a lot of sensitivities around individuals' healthcare. So standing, in a grocery store and asking people about chronic health conditions, probably not a great idea. Instead, we do that sort of more in private, but always still find a way to talk to your customers, meet them where they are. And this varies quite a bit between B2C and B2B. You still need to talk to your customers if you're a B2B company. It might just be a little bit harder, and you might need to compensate a little bit more for their time, but it's still very important to find where your customers are and to talk to them. And don't underestimate, the customer lists and relationships that your team might already have. So we maintain a list of all of our users on our consumer product that have told us that they'd be interested in doing interviews and having conversations around specific topics, right? So, whatever is listed in your CRM and tagging individual customers that might be interested. So you can sort of maybe tag them with what topics they'd be useful, they'd be interested in, and contacting them. Customer support might have individual customers that are just like super users that you would want to get on the phone with. Working with your sales team, company events and conferences, just kind of make it a habit to, as a kind of maybe a monthly or quarterly thing, reaching out to specific segments of your customers and say, we would love to talk to you. And here's what we'll offer for your time. And I think it is very important to compensate them for their time because as you might imagine, there's some amount of self-selection bias that will happen here. You don't want to only talk to people, and this is what ends up happening, especially with surveys and the like, but you either get one of two extremes, someone that is very opinionated, that they love your product, or very opinionated that they hate your product. And it's actually hard to get anyone sort of in the middle of that curve. So compensating helps do that just a little bit, right? It's not someone who's just personally very passionate, either in the positive or the negative, but someone who's also just coming because they're getting paid appropriately for their time. And there are plenty of ways to recruit participants as well, right? Just like you would run an advertisement, a Facebook ad campaign to find users and get them onboarded. You could also use it to find participants for your customer research, or even post on our marketplaces like Craigslist. There are a lot of different methods available for this sort of customer research. This is by no means an exhaustive list of methods or platforms that you could use, but I've generally found that this is, using some mix of these methods is usually the right answer. So, interviews, I've been talking about that a lot. We're actually currently in the middle of a big push on my team to conduct all of these virtual interviews and build out our personas and user journeys. So, one-on-one interviews, I think, are very, very powerful. And even though it might feel a little bit inefficient in the moment, the richness of what you get from a one-on-one conversation, whether that's between the PM and a user, or between a customer, a UX researcher, or a designer, whoever it is on the team that's doing this, it is incredibly valuable to have these one-on-one conversations. Focus groups, a little less excited about. I think often when you have a group of customers in the same room together, they tend to sort of influence each other. And even though it feels like it might be more efficient, at the end of the day, you end up getting sort of less accurate, and perhaps you haven't dug as deep because the individual doesn't feel as comfortable because they're in a group with a bunch of strangers. Usability testing is incredibly powerful. There's some great platforms. I have some examples here: usertesting.com, UserZoom. They both have good tools around this, where you essentially have this is getting to the solution hypothesis, right? On the right side of my prior slide. What is the mock-up of the product, or even just a sketch of what the product could look like, and showing that to users, even unmoderated, right? User testing has several great features where you can essentially pull together like an Envision prototype, for example, and then get back videos of users clicking around. And you can see, and they'll also be sort of speaking in real time. And you can observe like, oh, this decision that I made on where the feature is, or this UX was confusing, and we should change that, right? So usability testing is more about customers and their behavior and their usage of an actual solution that you've mocked up or maybe even already have launched. And then finally, surveys. Got to be careful about this because it misses a lot of context. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a fair amount of self-selection that happens on who fills out a survey, but huge advantage of survey is just the efficiency with which you can gather data. So running a SurveyMonkey or some other survey tool that you might use, and getting, simple as maybe an NPS survey, but even getting a bit deeper, right? Like what are your specific feature ideas or what are your unmet needs? Being very thoughtful about how you answer those questions, right? So lots of great methods available to us out there. All right, so wrapping up this section again with a poll. So we went through a few different methods. I'm curious, which one of these methods have you used in the past? So Shama, please launch that poll. Great. All right, so far I think we've seen just interviews and surveys. So interesting. I think our group has more experience with surveys and interviews than focus groups and usability testing. Not surprised on focus groups. I think there is perhaps limited value in doing those. Usability testing, I highly recommend trying this out. It is so powerful for to quickly go from even a sketch or wireframes or a clickable prototype and showing it to actual users and getting that feedback well before you write a line of code. It tells you a lot about some of the assumptions you might have made about pain points and about your hypotheses. It also just tells you a lot about just good design, right? How do you create an experience that is uncluttered, that is good UX and easy to use? Great. So we'll move to the final section here and then we'll pause for questions. So product analytics, probably closest to my heart. So product analytics is as much about the infrastructure and the framing of your metrics as it is about the actual skill set about data analysis, right? So, you really need to start with what are your North Star metrics. And I just have a few sort of guiding principles here on what really makes a good metric. And these are just sort of general heuristics. This may or may not apply in every case. But for us, especially with sort of building health programs, where where the number one most important thing is just engagement, right? Did this individual submit their weekly log every week? And did they consume the content that we served back to them and contact their doctor when they were prompted to? Right? All of those are sort of engagement questions. And therefore our North Star metrics are very much around sort of retention and monthly active users. And in general, the way you want to think about what makes a good metric is, oftentimes you might sort of go deep into like, oh, what is this sort of specific arcane metric that most captures, like, that can sort of predict like business value and engagement. But simplicity is so important here, making sure that your metrics are understandable. Right? That if you're always explaining what your metric means, or worse yet, if people misunderstand what it is and misinterpret it, it's not going to be valuable as a management tool. It's not going to be valuable as a decision-making tool. Comparisons are always helpful. Are we on an upwards trajectory or downwards? Rates and ratios are very helpful. An absolute value, like we have 300 monthly active users, isn't necessarily helpful, but over our retention rate, so the percentage of users that we retained over 30 days, much more valuable. And then finally, just really think, design a metric like you design a product, right? The metric should be designed in a way that drives behavior change, right? It drives effective decision-making and prioritization in your teams. And just a quick reminder to all of us to be very careful about vanity metrics. So oftentimes, if we focus too much on things like, number of enrolled or number of signed up users, or number of Facebook likes. Those are great, and those are probably bigger numbers than perhaps things that are lower down in the funnel, but they don't necessarily capture actual business value and outcomes, which is very important as a PM, because that is what ultimately you will be responsible for. So it's often hard to start sort of with a clean slate on what metrics to define, and there are great frameworks out there. Not going to go through this in detail, but just wanted to sort of give you a starting point. The R metric framework I think is very helpful, especially for consumer products. So thinking about like, what are each of these key questions in every step along the way in your funnel? And then what is the North Star metric that you define? And then sort of the muscle that you build to report on that and to learn from it. So, where does this data come from? As I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, there is a big difference between the first two buckets and this one. The first two buckets are more about sort of qualitative research. And then this final one about product analytics is much more quantitative. So you need something that's sort of generating this data, and there are fantastic platforms already out there, right? You should not be having your engineering team kind of build a custom implementation for managing events and timestamps and user behavior. They're great platforms like Google Analytics, Firebase, Mixpanel, Amplitude, and platforms like Segment that actually aggregate across all these different sources. So pick which one makes sense to you. And as a part of all of your product requirements, always include sort of as a checklist in all of your Jira tickets or sort of whatever tool you're using, part of your checklist should be, what are my analytics requirements along with this feature, right? How do I instrument up this feature that I'm launching so that I know what users actually do out in the wild? That's the data generation side. Then there's also the analysis and reporting side. So it is critically important that PMs don't need to rely on sort of a data science team or some other function in order to conduct analysis. Data should just be, it should be the lifeblood of a product team. And whenever you have a question about, is a certain type of customer, a certain type of user engaging with this feature, it might be, geography, it might be language, it might be gender, demographics, anything. We need to be able to quickly say, okay, I want to slice my data by this dimension, and I want to see, what the existing user behavior is. So whatever tool you use for that, I think it's very important to have the right infrastructure in place. I'm personally a huge fan of Tableau. I know there are lots of teams that are a big fan of Looker and Qlik, Power BI, QuickSight, which is from AWS, et cetera. But this is as much about having the right tool and infrastructure in place as it is about just the basic skill of data visualization. And it's something that you learn over time, just like any other skill that you have in your toolkit as a PM. There are amazing examples out there, and it's sometimes fun to go down this rabbit hole of bad data visualizations. And you're seeing a couple here, right? These are absolutely terrible for decision making. I mean, they're both an absolute eyesore and just not effective data visualizations. So just sort of learning over time through experimentation, through looking at, all the great resources out there on, what is the right visual representation of data to help me make decisions. And the great thing is tools like Tableau make that quite a bit easier than it might have been in the past. Where you have sort of templates and you can just sort of drag and drop the different fields and generate charts that might even be interactive, right? That you can publish to your teams. All right, so just starting to wrap up here, final poll for you all. What are your preferred tools to analyze product analytics and to sort of conduct analysis and report it to your stakeholders? Great. I see that the tried and true tools, Excel and Google Sheets win. They win every time. And I think it makes a lot of sense, right? When you want to do sort of quick and dirty analysis, just go to Excel or Google Sheets. But when you have kind of bigger requirements, and certainly when you want to create dashboards that can be shared with stakeholders, it's very helpful to try out some of the more advanced BI tools. So I'm just going to wrap up here before we pause for questions. So just kind of pulling all of this together, right? Some concepts that you've probably heard a lot about, tying it to what we just discussed. We hear about MVP all the time, right? Minimum viable product. Putting it into the context of what we just discussed. And I really like this sort of branching diagram because it sort of demonstrates that building a product, a lot of it is about quickly learning as soon as possible what's not going to work, right? Which branch you're going to go down and then stop, and then invest in a different branch. And for me, that's what the MVP is about. I want to learn the most. I want to learn the most, right? That's the key word, with the least amount of effort, so that I can determine whether or not my hypotheses were validated or invalidated, and therefore, what's the next action that I should take as a PM. And similarly, as we all know, launching your MVP or launching your first release is not the beginning. It's not the end, right? That's not your goal. It's the beginning. It is where you've now started the race and you are now getting feedback, measuring what your users are actually doing using all the concepts that we just discussed, learning, testing all of your assumptions, and then prioritizing what to build next. So learning is very much a continuous process and not one that you sort of do in phases, right? That you sort of conduct your market research, then your customer discovery, and then do your product analytics, and then sort of go home. No, all three of those are happening simultaneously at all times. And it's about testing those assumptions and then incorporating them into what you build next. Great. So just to wrap up, if you remember nothing else from what we talked about today, I want to leave you with two thoughts. One, learning is very much a cultural thing. The expectation should be set from the top that when we don't know the answer to a question, or when a question is posed, whether it's product strategy or feature design, et cetera, the reaction that everyone has is, here's my hypothesis, and now let's go learn it together, right? As opposed to, the highest paid person in the room saying, this is the answer, now go build. That'd be point number one. Point number two is it's great to conduct all of this research, and to have learning a part of your culture, but especially in distributed teams, especially as your team and organization grows and matures, documentation is critically important. It's a little bit annoying, it's a little bit time consuming, but whether you use Google Docs, Confluence, Notion, or something else, make sure that your knowledge gets captured, and make sure that it's captured in a way that's actionable for future people that join the team, or even for yourself, for posterity. All right, so that's actually everything that I wanted to go through. Thank you so much for sort of bearing with me as I went through what are oftentimes considered very different topics, but I think all fall under the bucket of learning. And with a few minutes left here, would be delighted to answer any questions that have come up.
Thank you for delivering a brilliant session, Vish. Really great and thought-provoking insights. We already have a few questions lined up for you, if you can see in the Q&A window. Give me a moment to share my screen. Audience, please go ahead and ask your questions in the Zoom Q&A window or on the LinkedIn section, comment section. And if any of you wants to come online and ask your questions directly to Vish, please feel free to do that. You can raise your hand and I can unmute you. Meanwhile, let's start with the first question here, Vish. The question from Pallav Mehta. I must say, Pallav, the first 5 minutes itself, you asked the question. Right. So the question being, as a product manager, is it always difficult to keep the area of focus for a new existing product, whether to focus on new user acquisition or working on existing user retention, as there are always product features or tasks in backlog from businesses as well as other stakeholders? Then how should a product manager prioritize?
Yeah, Pallav, I think this is a great question. And as with most sort of prioritization questions, unfortunately, the answer is it depends. But hopefully I can shed a little bit more insight than that, which is, especially in the context of learning, you actually have to, your sources of information on a new customer and an existing customer are completely different, right? So existing users, you have the benefit of them already being engaged with your product, so you can see what they're actually doing, right? You should ask them how do they feel about your product, net promoter score and whatever other tools you want to use, but you can also see what they're doing. Whether that's an aggregate using your product analytics or using something like Hotjar, right, where you can actually literally see sort of the cursor move around. That's very different from a potential new customer, because by definition, they're not in the product yet. And you have to rely on what is truly less accurate sources to understand what they need. So I'll sort of flip around your question on how do you prioritize what to learn in order to prioritize who to focus on, and using the right method for each of those groups. And what I would suggest is there's always a tension, right, between how do you expand for existing segments versus expand the segments themselves. And what I would say is hone in on where is there the greatest unmet need. So if you're observing that you have customers that are very engaged and are clamoring for a new feature, prioritize that. If your existing customers are generally happy and engaged, and part of your product strategy is expand to new areas, do that research and then find where there are the greatest unmet needs. Because at the end of the day, this decision is about where you can drive the most value for your customer versus starting with the answer, which is, I believe I should solve for new or existing users.
Great. I hope that answers your question, Pallav.
Great.
Right. So we have the next question by Rohit Nagpal. Rohit, you have a 3-part question. I would encourage you to come online and ask a question live if you're comfortable with that. Giving you a few seconds. Okay, he has raised his hands. Okay. Rohit, you can go ahead and ask a question.
Hi. This is about the thing that you mentioned, that you should download the competitors' apps for research purposes. So I have worked in B2B enterprise product environment, and it was clearly mentioned that you can't install the app for competitor analysis. So wanted to understand from you if that is different for B2C apps, and for enterprise B2B products, I mean, how and where should you draw the line?
Yeah, Rohit, that's a great question. And generally the way I think about B2B is that all of the concepts we talked about today are all very relevant and perhaps even more relevant, but the methods sometimes vary. So you're right, it's a lot harder, even for like sort of legal and compliance reasons, right, to actually kind of experience a competitor's product. And part of it might be internal sort of rules around this, but also it's just, most B2B products are behind a sales team, right? You can't just go in and sign up for the trial yourself. You have to talk to the sales team. So, all that is to say, it's harder to experience the customer's product, but not impossible. I think it just means you should try harder as a PM, right? So some strategies that I've used in the past is training materials. So any like product marketing that they put out, oftentimes there'll be series on YouTube or even on their website, and sort of looking as wherever you can for the actual product, right? Not the sort of sales pitch, but the demo of the product. So anything that's publicly available, you can learn quite a bit from that. The other thing I'd say is, in terms of, this is sort of bleeding into customer research a little bit, but oftentimes for B2B, there's a very small group of buyers, right? So especially if you're like selling into, mid to large size companies, it's often going through like a specific function or even like the procurement team. And what's very interesting there is it's a smaller kind of group of people, just in terms of absolute numbers, that see all of the different options. And by definition, many companies will do sort of like a procurement process, right? Where they compare, here are all the different options, here's how it maps to our needs, and here's the pricing. And if you can talk directly to someone in procurement or directly to someone that as a part of their job, they're comparing the different solutions, you get sort of a direct line into, okay, so then what is the comparison between my competitors and my product? So just a few options to consider in B2B, but certainly hear you that it's a little bit harder than consumer, where you can just go to the App Store and install.
Thank you. Can I ask my other 2 questions as well?
Sure, Rohit, please.
Okay, so you were talking about market research on pricing. So that tells the PM the price baseline for a product or a service. However, if we are a B2B startup and believe we have a differentiated product, that is, we should charge more. So I wanted to ask you if you have any suggestions or best practices on how to economically convince the users using competitor products to switch.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So it's actually a very interesting one because in some ways, learning about pricing, about optimal pricing is very different from learning about optimal product and product design. And it's for one very specific reason, which is it's very hard to increase your price. It is not that hard to change a feature that you've launched based on feedback, but it's much harder to start with a hypothesis on pricing and then increase it. So for that reason, as well as just like, generally, I think, when you're very close to the product, you observe all of its flaws. As a general principle, Rohit, price higher than you think you need to. Price higher than the market, price higher than what you think the market can bear, and lower from there if needed. And I think this is important because, first of all, you don't want to build a product that's just sort of parity from everyone else. So, by definition, you believe, you have a hypothesis that you're building something that is differentiated, that has some sort of premium value above the market, the existing solutions. So test that, test whether that's true, test whether that you can command a higher price based on the value that you believe that your product is offering, but also preserve your optionality, right? So start higher. It's easier to lower your pricing than it is to go higher. So I would be comfortable with getting a lot of no's because my pricing is too high in my initial sales conversations for example, launching a beta or something like that, rather than getting too many yeses and then realizing later on that I'm not charging enough. The one sort of thing to keep in mind here is there are ways to get around it. You can think about like launching a beta where you explicitly say, we are offering you a discount in your first year because our product is new in exchange for your feedback. So that gives you some options to sort of increase pricing later on. But the pricing question is a very important one. And I think overall, I'd leave you with charge more than you would your gut reaction would say.
Thank you. My last question was that
Rohit, in view of time constraints, I'm so sorry, but we'll come back to you in case we have a little more time left. And I'm sure Vish also has to hurry. Thank you for participating, Rohit. And if given a chance, we'll take your question in the end. So we'll go to the next question here, Vish. This is from anonymous attendee. Anyways, could you explain the tasks of a product manager in the below roles? Beginner, this is where I'm going to start in PM world. Intermediate and expert.
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, that question is basically answered in two ways. One is a product manager solves problems, right? A product manager solves problems usually for end users. So the first thing is, what is the scope or the size of the problem that you are tasked with solving in the product? So that's gonna be number one. And then number two is PMs, as you get more senior, are also in charge of running a function. So building product management as a capability. So I would say that, in general, the way you can think about as you get more senior, in your entry level position as a PM, you'll be an individual contributor. So you're not yet responsible for hiring and building product management as a team. Instead, you're responsible for your personal actions and your personal priorities around kind of building the product. And the scope of your problem that you're solving will also likely be smaller, right? So you have to start somewhere, and everything in the product down to like, how does the notifications, how do you enable different types of notifications and what settings are available, right? That's an example of a problem that the customer has is I want to manage how this product contacts me for various things. And an associate PM or whatever sort of the entry level PM title would be tasked with solving that problem. But as you get more senior, the scope of the problem will increase, right? So the scope of the problem that I'm currently tasked with is better managing chronic conditions, right? And there's a lot that breaks down into specific user needs that we'll tackle. And also sort of, more senior in the product management career, you're also hiring and coaching and building up the product management function so that we can scale. so that as our product scales, as the scope of what we're building and the breadth of our stakeholders and size of our engineering team increases, that we have the appropriate sort of ratio of product management to engineering, design, et cetera.
Moving on to the last question, possibly. If that's okay, then we have 2 more questions, which we could take both, but it's up to you, your time.
Yeah, I think perhaps we end with one more question.
Right. Okay, so there is a little bit of elaboration that explain a little more on that. The question is, can you elaborate the matrix slide? I think the one before product analytics instrumentation. I mean, that was a key learning. So if you could just elaborate a little on it. You want to share your screen, Vish?
You know, to be honest, I'm not sure which slide we're talking about here.
The before product analytics instrumentation.
Oh, are we talking about the R matrix, the framework for?
I believe so.
Okay. Just share my screen here.
Okay, I have to stop sharing 1 second.
No worries.
Yeah, you can do that now.
So just to confirm, is this the slide that we're referring to?
Audience, please respond in the chat window. I believe this is the slide because it's the one that you use a matrix in. So yes, okay, we got an answer, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, and we're just asking for some elaboration on it. So essentially the way you can think about this is, ultimately, when you define metrics, they can be sort of closer to the top of the funnel or to the bottom of the funnel. And those are both equally important. And by the top and bottom of the funnel, what I mean is their journey in your product, ultimately to sort of generating business value, right? So at the top of the funnel, it's someone that might have just been introduced to the product. So, acquisition, it's capturing like, how many people from our paid marketing campaigns actually came to the product, clicked on an ad, for example, or installed the app. And as you get further down this funnel, by definition, unless you have like a remarkable product that has 100% retention, your metrics will get, the numbers will get smaller, right? So the percentage of people that convert into paid users will be smaller than the percentage of people that are activated or acquired in the first place. So I want to be careful not to anchor too much to this, right? This is just a framework more centered around like consumer products on the types of metrics that you would want to track that get you closer and closer to the final action that you care most about, right? Or that demonstrate most value that's been delivered to the customer. So this I would just sort of treat as a starting point. But in your specific context, whether it's like B2B, right, where there's no distinction perhaps between a free customer and a paid customer, you'll want to think about what is actually your funnel, the journey from someone that you've just been introduced to your product to being sort of an ongoing, engaged, paid user. What is a metric that captures that? And which ones are sort of like leading indicators, right? Which ones tell you that you're on the right track or you're trending in the wrong direction? And which ones do you sort of just report to your board, right? Or to your executive leadership, like here's how much revenue we were able to generate, but may not be as helpful in product decision-making.
Perfect. So audience, in view of the time constraints, we will have to end the Q&A here. But in case we've missed out on any questions, please scan this QR code and get a 30-minute coaching session with our faculty and get your doubts clarified. And particularly to this webinar, if you have any questions, I'm sure, Vish, it's okay with you if our audience reaches out to you over LinkedIn or any other medium that you suggested?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you for your participation, audience.
Thank you all so much.
We have enjoyed having you with us, Vish. It's been a complete pleasure. Please accept
Likewise,
the certificate of appreciation from the Institute, a small gesture. So if you scan the QR code on your certificate, it'll take you to a dedicated Hall of Fame page that we have created for you, which will hold the recording of the session. So please share it within your network and we'll be sharing the recording on the YouTube channel as well. We are grateful for the time and effort you put and share your thoughts and amazing insights drawn from the years of experience that you have in the industry. And I'm certain that the audience will definitely benefit from the methods you suggested and get ahead in their career. Thank you once again, Vish, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Shama, and to the Institute of Product Leadership. Great meeting you all.
And audience, thank you for joining in. It was great interacting with you all. Do not forget to register for the webinar tomorrow. And with that note, I end tonight's session. Happy learning and stay skilled. Have a great night. You have a good day, Vish. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you.